Suraya Marshall, Commodore Suraya Marshall. It's very good to see you.
Great to see you as well, Craig.
Thank you so much for joining us for this 20-minute conversation about decision-making and the influences on it. So Suraya, perhaps we could just start by inviting you just to introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, by all means. I'm currently Commandant Cranwell, so responsible for all Phase 1 training, but also the TEDA Leadership Academy and the Robson Academy of Resilience, and also all of the university squadrons as well. So at that end of the spectrum, but leadership and decision making, really, really important part of what we do and what we deliver.
Great. So let's see if we can explore that a little further over the next 20 minutes or so. So perhaps we could start by just inviting you to reflect a little on the organisation that you run. Obviously, a large, complex organisation, and obviously many thousands of decisions, I suppose, going on almost daily inside that organisation. How you, as Commandant, think about ensuring that those decisions are the right ones, that the decision-making processes work well. I mean, how do you do that as Commandant?
It's a really big question, Craig. I mean, in theory, mission command, empowering your people, is what we should all be striving to deliver, and the kind of environment that you, working environment that your team work in. So they're empowered to make the decisions. They understand your intent clearly, and everything runs on rails. But of course, in reality, that is not the case. Some people are less comfortable with making those decisions and being empowered themselves. Sometimes intent is not always clear. And of course, I think the inherent issue with mission command and empowerment is rank and hierarchy. So it's quite difficult to kind of juggle those two things and get the balance absolutely right. I think it's something that we actively have to really work hard at trying to do. And of course, creating an environment where people, if they do make the wrong decisions, then it's okay. It's okay to make the wrong decisions sometimes. We learn from it. There's no kind of repercussions. We carry on, and it doesn't kind of affect them personally and individually. I think that's in a nirvana, that's the way it should work. I think in practice, it's very, very hard, particularly in a military organisation.
To get it right. So thanks, Roy. So there's 2 or 3 key things that you've mentioned there that perhaps unpick a little bit more. You mentioned the term empowerment, and that's one we commonly hear, isn't it, in terms of decision making. So one of the principles you're trying to work to is presumably that decisions are made at the right level by the right person, I suppose, if I can just define empowerment in that way. So that's one area. You also mentioned sort of a balance or a potential tension between mission command and rank, if I understood that correctly. Is that right? You don't those two don't necessarily always sit well together. This is my interpretation of what you said. Is that something that you're conscious of or aware of?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think if you think about, there's a more sort of traditional kind of military way of working, and I don't necessarily think the Air Force is like this so much nowadays. But if you sort of wind the clock back 10, 20 years, very, very hierarchical. You had to refer decisions up the chain of command. And there are, of course, still occasions when you absolutely still have to do that. But I think that rank structure and the chain of command structure is inherently a kind of a tension when it comes to mission command. So I think as leaders and people higher up the chain of command, you have to be very conscious of that and actually kind of work to relieve that tension and give people the real freedom to be able to make those decisions. And as I say, one key aspect of that, in my opinion, is allowing people to make mistakes, accepting the fact that something is not going to be perfect or exactly the way that you would have done it or you would have decided, but you can live with it. Because otherwise you disempower your people to make those decisions.
Indeed, which was a really interesting insight, was the third thing that you mentioned, this idea of well, not permission to make mistakes, but certainly creating an environment where they feel like they're not, I guess, going to be punished for wrong decisions. And I don't know whether it's really obvious why that should be the case, but perhaps you just say why you think that is so important for us and the decision making process.
Because if you don't have that culture, people won't make decisions. They will avoid making the decision. They will refer everything up the chain of command, and unless they know they can do it, they can. There's no sort of comeback on them, as it were, if it's not the perfect answer. Then you're absolutely kind of creating the opposite environment. You're disempowering your people.
And creating a bottleneck, essentially,
Yeah.
that things just don't
People
get.
will just avoid making decisions and kind of refer everything up because they don't want to take that risk to them personally.
Is that right? And as a operating in a non-rank based organisation, doesn't rank almost oblige you to make those decisions? Perhaps it's a really silly question, but if you carry a rank, doesn't that sort of almost entail an authority to make decisions as opposed to refer them up?
You would think so, but I think most people, unless you're the chief or the three or the four star at the top of that chain of command, there's always somebody higher up, isn't there? So in theory, yes, and what we try and teach here at Cranwell to our young cadets and junior officers is to absolutely take responsibility, make decisions. This is ultimately your job as a leader, but in practice, unless the conditions are right for somebody to feel that they genuinely can, that is their decision to make, and they won't constantly be overridden by their chain of command, then clearly they're not going to do it.
Right. And so some of those conditions are indeed about whether they feel empowered, whether they feel like it's okay broadly to make a mistake and learn from that mistake, and therefore potentially sometimes make the wrong decision. So those are some of the conditions that you try and put in place to allow that to happen. Is that right? What else do you have in the Royal Air Force in terms of decision-making structures, frameworks? Obviously we're talking about things like the ethical nature of decisions these days, the impact on society, the impact of culture on decision-making process. Are these some of the considerations that you have in terms of the organizations that you run and how those affect decision-making?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, the way we teach leadership and decision making, kind of in the phase 1 training environment for officers, is absolutely underpinned by our core ethos and values. So respect, integrity, service, and excellence, and the responsibility and commitment that comes with that in all that we do, in the way that we lead, and the decisions that we make. So I think that is a really important part. I think the cultural aspect is really interesting, because I think the how much we consider culture and the differences of a culture in our routine decision making. So I'm not necessarily talking about operational decision making here. I'm talking about routine decision making, how we formulate policy, decide what is right for the service. Being able to incorporate all of those cultural differences is the key argument for why we need to be diverse. And to those who don't understand why diversity is important, I think it is absolutely this point. It is the essence of effective decision making, because we're all products of our experience and our understanding. And if we're too homogenous, if we all have the same experience, then our understanding is likely to be the same. We're likely to view the world in the same way, and therefore we're likely to make a certain type of decision. And so actually having real diversity and different views and different understandings and different experiences actually helps us to make far better decisions.
So the two key elements there. One is the way that the importance of the RISE values in affecting the way decisions are made, and the incorporation of different viewpoints, value systems, diversity of thinking, and cognitive diversity, almost, I think, if we can call it that, such that decisions that are made are better in the way that they're in the way that better value, avoiding groupthink, I suppose, would be the way to describe that. So those are two key elements, are they, in the decision-making process?
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite interesting when you try and kind of, I'm the BAME advocate, when you try and kind of break down this idea of privilege, it's very difficult for people to understand, because often, no, I'm not privileged, I don't have this. But it's about this idea that if you're in the majority, the decisions are sort of made by the majority, by the way that the majority sort of see the world, for the benefit of the majority. And then the unintended consequences that you disenfranchise the minority. So, being able to consider all perspectives in decision making at whatever level is a really, really key part to being more inclusive as an organisation, and ultimately not, having those unintended consequences of disenfranchising the minority, and also improving the quality of your decision making. And of course, you roll that across to the operational output of what the Air Force delivers, and it means that we're more able to understand how our adversaries might think, how threats might impact us, how our decisions, may alter and affect the enemy, etc., etc. So it is absolutely that cognitive diversity.
That's so interesting, because often I think people often assume that decision making is quite an individual process. And I suspect this is the case in the RF, is it not, that where you have that authority, that responsibility, that rank, and therefore the decision is yours? But in a sense, you're suggesting that perhaps the incorporation of different viewpoints into that decision-making process, even if somebody ultimately has that final decision, that others are involved in that. I'm just interested in the sort of mechanics almost of how you incorporate that diversity into the process.
Yeah, so I think, ultimately, yes, our job as leaders and as we get more senior in rank is absolutely to make decisions, and ultimately, the buck stops with us and we have to decide what to do. And I think often decision making is quite intuitive, especially as you get more experienced. You will understand, you'll have seen something a bit like this before. You'll intuitively know kind of what you think the right decision should be. But actually, it's almost at that point when you are very experienced, when your decision making is defined by your experiences, that it's even more important that you consult more broadly. And I think, in terms of building your teams and the team that you choose to work on a certain project, or who you have in your headquarters, it's really, really important to think carefully about who you have. Because you probably should understand where your own blind spots are, where your intuition and decision making will lead you, because of the way that you view the world. And I think it's really important to surround yourself with people who perhaps cover those blind spots and challenge that intuition, where you think, I'm sure this is the right decision. And that process of consultation, I think, is really important, in terms of, getting the right decision at the end of it, but also making sure that the people in your team that you are leading feel as if they're contributing to that process and are therefore valued and being listened to.
Indeed. So it almost has a two or three benefits, doesn't it? You've got a wider population involved in the decision-making process and therefore feeling like they're engaged and contributing. And it's allowing you to almost act as and these are my words, you have a foil to you in a sense. So they're not people who are fundamentally always like you and always thinking in the same way, so that you're reassuring yourself that actually the decisions you're making are probably better because they've been tested in that way.
Yeah, they're sort of red teaming your thought process and determining whether intuition is right or whether you're actually blinded to a certain way of thinking or other opportunities.
I do. Is that this is perhaps a really difficult question to answer, Suraya. Is that now common in the Royal Air Force? I mean, could you say that, because it sounds like very much how you do things as a senior leader. Is that now widespread in the way that decision making happens in the RF?
I would hope that it is more widespread. I mean, if you look at how we teach leadership now and our leadership philosophy, it starts off with know yourself, that sort of know yourself, lead yourself. So that idea of self-awareness, understanding where your blind spots might be, I think is becoming more and more commonplace. Certainly it's what we're teaching people as they come through the door, and all the sort of other leadership interventions as they go through their career. And the 360 reporting, the 180-degree reporting, all of these tools help to contribute to your own self-awareness and understanding of your own blind spots, your own weaknesses, and where you're likely to potentially go wrong. And I think, as well, the personal attributes, being able to, be humble enough to ask somebody's opinion, to accept challenge. Again, a lot of this is a cultural shift for the Royal Air Force, but I think it is becoming more and more commonplace. Certainly our focus on training in the early days is absolutely all of those things.
Right. No, that's really interesting. If I may also come back to a word that you used and let's explore a bit more was intuition. So often I think one of the things that we think about decision making, of course, is very much evidence-based, fact-based. You assemble all of those facts, you get as much information and quality information available to you, and then you make the decision. But you feel that intuition still plays an important role, does it, in the decision making process?
So I think as you get more experience, and
Right.
so is it intuition or is it experience? You know, you've seen it before, you understand it, you kind of know what the outcome is. It's probably experience that leads to therefore intuition. I think, you know, you have to. It's a balance of both things, isn't it? And it really depends on what you're deciding on. Clearly, you know, you have to do your research, you have to get the evidence, there has to be a logic. And you have to make decisions based on all of that evidence that you've got in front of you. But the more times you do it and the more experience that you get, you will probably intuitively know what you think the outcome might be. Likewise, there might be something in the back of your head that sort of says, actually, this isn't quite right. You know, we're missing something here. We need to look at this. You know, this isn't the right outcome. So I do think it has an important part to play, but only when nested in amongst all those other factors. And of course, it depends absolutely on what sort of decision you're making and how big it is.
Right. So it's something that you would consider not irrelevant to the decision-making process, particularly, as you say, when you've had that experience, which almost in some ways I think it is the sixth sense is an interesting way of describing it, because I think it has been noted that sometimes people will take in things without necessarily knowing it, and therefore their intuition is based indeed on being able to interpret a situation almost subconsciously. So and add it to the facts that you have available to you. So it's really interesting that to explore how intuition works in that sense. So it's really good to hear that's part of it. I wonder also, Suraya, if it's always good to look at sort of a couple of concrete examples of this process in play almost. And I wonder whether there's anything from your experience that you'd be prepared to share with us, that perhaps a decision that you've been involved recently that it is possible to make public, about how you've experienced some of these things in practice. Would it be possible to do that and talk through it?
Yeah, I'd say if I take us back to the beginning of COVID and the lockdown, it was a pretty turbulent kind of period here at Cranwell. We were sort of directed to continue delivering phase 1 training in, you know, a really unforeseen and unexpected set of circumstances, trying to understand what COVID meant, what the pandemic meant, what the restrictions are. A huge amount of ambiguity, so no real kind of you know, understanding of how we were going to do it and how we could keep people safe. No real understanding of how people were going to react to it as well. And actually, I think one of the really interesting things was seeing the breadth of reaction from those who were very blasé to it to those who were terrified by it genuinely for themselves and for their families. You know, we had to make a whole range of decisions in those sort of early days. You know, the first one being we've got to try and continue, but how do we continue? And then finally, the decision to stop a proportion of training and refocus our efforts. You know, again, difficult. There wasn't a lot of evidence. There was, you know, it was very reactive. There was a lot of ambiguity. You kind of were weighing in all of these different inputs, trying to understand people's reactions. Some people wanted really, really clear direction. Other people were really happy to work in ambiguity. Other people just wanted to go home and shut their doors and wait till the whole thing was over. I think, you know, so many different decisions were made in those first few weeks, some bad, but then we reversed the decisions and we sort of pivoted and did something different. And I think there were a whole host of lessons in there. There was sort of intuition, there was trying to get the evidence, but then actually making decisions before you had the evidence because it just felt wrong and we had to do something else. There was a sort of hearts and minds bit, trying to sort of keep everybody on board. And reassure everybody. So a huge amount sort of wrapped up in there. A huge amount of consultation as well with the team. There was very much a sense of trying to find our way through it. and a recognition that some people were really, really uncomfortable with ambiguity. They just wanted to be told exactly what they should do and how they should do it. So a whole host of stuff in there. I'm not sure if that's a helpful illustration, actually, but certainly very challenging decisions in a very challenging set of circumstances.
No, I think it's a great example, and I knew you'd find a good one with a bit of thought to write, and actually a perfect example actually of how ambiguity plays in, because you mentioned that a couple of times in a situation where you really had no sort of precedent to operate against, and a very uncertain environment. And it sounds like the collective nature of what you did was actually quite crucial at that point. So it doesn't strike me that you were saying that you felt totally alone in making those decisions, that you had a collective process going on where others were contributing all the time to that decision-making process.
No, absolutely. And I was very, very fortunate to have a really kind of good team, and we were collectively scratching our heads and putting our heads together and trying to figure out what the best things, what the best choices were, what the best decisions were. And I think trying to do it any other way in that set of circumstances would have been nigh on impossible.
Indeed, and a process whereby you certainly implied that clearly you weren't going to make all of those decisions correctly, but you had a process, it sounds like, of reviewing them and then changing them where you had to make them, where you had to change them.
And I think we set out, this is what we're going to do, this is what we have to do, this is what we're going to do, but we will not shy away from changing this or reversing these decisions if that is the right thing to do. So again, it's not kind of feeling constrained by the decisions that you've made previously. Absolutely accepting, no, this isn't working. Okay, we'll try something else. We'll reapportion people over there. We'll shut this part of the training down. We'll focus efforts over here. So really, sort of feeling your way through the circumstances and not being frightened of going back on decisions that you've made, and I think that's important. There were no right answers. There were lots of different ways that we could have done it.
Indeed. Soraya, thank you so much for that. And as usual, we're up against our time. It flies past when we've got such interesting subjects to talk about. So, and I think that's a great one to finish on. There are many insights there that we can, that I'm sure that colleagues can learn from. So, Soraya, it just remains for me to thank you on behalf of the TEDR Academy and the university for your time this afternoon and contributing to this discussion. So, thank you so much, Soraya.
No problems. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.